Picture an outlaw crouched at a river's edge, cupping water into his hands and thinking he's finally caught a break. He has no idea what's waiting upstream or what's been dumped into that flow for the last 50 miles, so he just drinks. That river wasn't salvation, it was a slow poison, and the reality is that bullets didn't kill most outlaws because their own bodies did the job first. Everything starts with the mouth, because that's where the damage showed up first. Outlaws on the run drank cheap rot gut whiskey constantly, and while they definitely liked the taste, they mostly did it because the local water was genuinely dangerous. Whiskey felt like the safer bet, but they didn't realize that rot gut was loaded with fermented sugars and scorched residue that coated their teeth in an acidic film. This film destroyed enamel fast, and if you drank enough of it for long enough, your teeth didn't just hurt, they rotted out from the inside. Toothbrushes didn't exist out there, so some men rubbed their teeth with a rough cloth while others chewed on a stick to try and stay clean. Most didn't bother at all because survival didn't leave much room for hygiene, and the decay just kept going until a tooth eventually obsessed. That pain was the kind that made it impossible to sleep or focus, and it definitely made it impossible to ride a horse with any kind of skill. This is where it gets worse because the only real option was extraction. On the frontier, that meant finding a barber or a blacksmith rather than a trained dentist, and you were lucky if they even wiped their pliers off first. These were the same tools used to pull nails from a horse's hoof, and they went straight into a man's mouth with no sterilization and no anesthetic. The only pain relief was another shot of that same rot gut whiskey, which actually thinned the blood and made the bleeding much worse than it needed to be. Doc Holliday is the famous case we all know, and while he was dealing with tuberculosis, he also suffered from severe dental decay. He was a man physically falling apart while he was still riding and gambling, which was actually the standard experience for outlaws of that era. Most of these men didn't get a spot in the history books, so they just got slower and sicker until they stopped being a problem for the law. They didn't die in a blaze of glory, their own bodies just gave out. When an outlaw finally rode into town, the saloon was always the first stop on the list. These places were warm, the whiskey flowed freely, and the bartenders generally knew better than to ask too many questions. But the truth is that the saloon wasn't safe for anyone. If you look at the bar rail, you'd see a communal towel hanging there for everyone to use. This was a single piece of fabric shared by every man who walked through the door that day, and they used it to wipe beer foam or sweat off their faces before hanging it back up. It was never washed and it was never changed, which meant every patron who touched it left something behind while picking up whatever the last 10 guys had. The whiskey sitting on the bar wasn't much better for your health. Rot gut wasn't actually a brand name, but rather a category for the cheap, dangerous stuff made from scorched sugar, raw alcohol, and tobacco remnants. People got sick from drinking it all the time, and while they usually assumed they just had one too many, the reality was that the liquor itself was often poisonous. The floors were thick with sawdust, but that wasn't there to give the room a rustic atmosphere. It served a functional purpose similar to how we use kitty litter today, because it was there to soak up the constant stream of tobacco spit that men deposited throughout the day. Brass spittoons lined the bar, but since aim was strictly optional, the sawdust absorbed the mess until it dried into a fine, infected dust that everyone inhaled just by breathing. Tuberculosis spread through that exact mechanism because the bacteria lived in droplets in the air and on every surface. Outlaws who slept on saloon floors to save money were essentially lying down on a thick layer of bacteria all night long, and every breath they took was another exposure to a deadly lung disease. Then you had to deal with the lice, which cowboys and outlaws nicknamed seam squirrels, because they loved to hide in the stitching of clothing and bedrolls. These pests didn't come out in the light, so they waited until nightfall to feed on whoever was sleeping in the straw mattresses. Most men used bear grease as a repellent by rubbing it into their hair and skin, but that crude barrier just attracted more dirt and made the physical misery even worse. Eventually, the outlaws would head back out into the open country to get away from the filth of the saloons and the lice in the bedding. They told themselves the wilderness was cleaner and that a running river was a guaranteed source of fresh water, but they couldn't have been more wrong. The real danger was happening miles upstream, where settlers were building outhouses right next to the water. It wasn't that these people were being careless on purpose, but they simply hadn't connected the dots between human waste and the sicknesses that were killing their neighbors. An outhouse might sit 20 yards from a creek, and everything in that pit would eventually seep into the water table and flow right down to the outlaw who was drinking from his cupped hands. Cattle operations made the situation even more disgusting. Livestock would stand and drink in the same streams that travelers used, depositing waste directly into the current as they moved. Mining camps further up the mountain dumped chemical runoff into the rivers without a second thought, and stagnant pools in low ground were even more dangerous because flies bred there in the thousands. The water might have looked clear and refreshing, but it was a cocktail of bacteria and waste. Cholera moved through that contaminated water with terrifying speed. The symptoms usually hit within a few hours, starting with severe cramps and leading to dehydration so extreme that a man who felt fine at breakfast could be dead before the sun went down. There was no real treatment out on the trail and no way to replace fluids fast enough to save a life, so most men didn't even realize the water was the problem until it was far too late. Cowboys and outlaws used these same water sources for drinking, cooking, and washing their gear, which meant cross-contamination was a constant and invisible threat. The James Younger gang had their movements disrupted by illness multiple times, proving that the law wasn't the only thing capable of stopping a famous outlaw. Disease moved through those camps the same way it moved through a crowded city because germs don't care about a man's reputation. The idea that clear, moving water was safe to drink was one of the most dangerous lies a man on the run could believe. It felt logical and it felt true, but it killed people who should have known to be more careful, even though nobody had explained what being careful actually meant yet. From the saloon floor to the open trail, an outlaw's body was fighting a war on every front, and most of the time, he didn't even know he was under attack. Hollywood loves a good gunfight, but the real killers on the frontier were much smaller and far more disgusting. Most men didn't die in a blaze of glory. Instead, they faced a slow physical collapse brought on by rotting teeth, infected wounds, and water that was basically poison. The outlaw life wasn't about freedom or adventure. It was a desperate struggle for survival in a world where basic hygiene didn't exist. If you want the gritty truth instead of the polished movie version, subscribe to Gunslinger Gazette right now. Tell me in the comments which part grossed you out the most. Was it the dental rot, the filthy towels, or the contaminated rivers?